Joining me now is Alexander Titov from Queens University Belfast in Northern Ireland. He's a lecturer in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics, and one of his specialisms is Russian foreign policy. Good to speak to you, Alexander. Now, where do you think Russia succeeded, if this does in fact succeed, these de-escalation zones, Russia, Turkey and Iran succeeded, where the United Nations could not after many rounds of peace talks in Geneva?
Well, I think basically it shows that what you really need to success is to have key players involved, and Russia, Iran and Turkey, particularly in the zones mentioned in your report in the north of Syria, are the key players there. And once there's agreement between them, it's much easier to proceed to concrete steps on the ground. So this can lay framework for wider political settlement in Syria, which will happen in Geneva when the sides meet. But the actual military grounds and the basics of political settlement are actually decided, particularly by the three powers in Astana.
And how much does war weariness play into this, Alexander, of course, and the aggression of all three nations? Of course, Russia have been heavily involved, Turkey have been heavily involved through Operation Euphrates Shield, and the Iranians are heavily involved. How much does that aggressive stance of the three nations play into this?
Well, I think that basically there was kind of recognition that by all sides that time is for some compromise. But from Russian point of view, basically they are doing it from the strength, from the position of strength, in a sense that they achieved military turnaround on the ground. Aleppo has fallen to the Assad regime. They are advancing very well in the east and in the Azov province. So now, according to all kind of points of strategies, now is kind of to consolidate those gains and reach a settlement. And Turkey as well. I mean, they basically see the limitations of how much they can actually fight around Syria and Russia at the same time. So so basically, kind of it suits all sides to come to it to some agreement now.
And you mentioned President Assad there. Of course, in the UN talks held in Geneva, they talk about baskets, and one of the baskets is the future of the Assad regime. How much does the future of Assad and his regime play into what's going on in Astana in the minds of the Russians, the Turks and Iran?
Well, I mean, basically, they're not going to kind of make any decisions about that. And I mean, I think basically de facto everybody recognizes that, removal of Assad is not the aim anymore. The aim now is to kind of find some sort of settlement, first military and then hopefully political one. So I think Assad, although people might say that, but basically it's not on the top of the agenda of anybody. And I mean, I don't see how they can actually remove him in the short to medium term anyway, if he doesn't want to go himself. And there's absolutely no reason for him to do so since he's winning.
Not at this point, but aren't they brewing up trouble for themselves later down the line? I mean, Assad and his regime were accused just last week of committing crimes against humanity, war crimes, by the launch of those chemical weapons attacks on Khan Sheikhoun. Surely, if he does stay in power, if this war does end in the next few years, he could face ICC prosecution.
Well, I wouldn't worry too much. I mean, he's already kind of faced prosecutions from all sorts of things. I mean, in terms of, I mean, as long as basically kind of we're talking not about, abstract values and law, we're talking about facts on the ground. Facts on the ground is that Assad is in charge. He has very powerful backers in Russia and Iran. The future, I mean, sort of shape of the future settlement might involve some kind of compromise. I don't know what that might be, but for now, basically, the issue is not Assad. The issue is basically division of Syria into zones of influence between different powers, and Assad being kind of within kind of Russia and Iran protectorate. So. Yeah. So that's the bottom line.
I mean, and before we come on to those zones of influence, because I do want to dig into that a little bit more, just sticking with Assad, I mean, you talk about him being supported. I mean, the position of the nations to support Assad after this war does end will be surely untenable, and the use of international law comes into question, doesn't it, if he does stay in power after this?
Well, I mean, but he's not gonna. Well, I mean, basically, there are issues of how long they want to be involved in Syria, issue of kind of reconstruction of Syria once the ending starts. For that, they would need some cooperation from European Union in particular, sort of channeling some funds, and they're certainly not going to fund reconstruction of Syria under Assad. So in long term, there are issues like that. International Criminal Court has very kind of patchy record of bringing people to justice, and certainly not the ones who are actually actively in power at the moment. So in the long term, there is certainly a problem, and if there is kind of enduring political settlement, future of Assad can be discussed, and some power sharing agreement might be negotiated, and maybe he will kind of, I don't know, symbolically step aside and so forth. But basically, he's in charge, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, not until he steps aside by his own volition, I suppose. You talked about zone of influence, Alexander. Finally, let's just discuss that somewhat. Now, how will these be supported, do you think, going forward for the next few years? And how welcome will those zones of influence be to people in Syria, especially with the Iranians perhaps having a controlling zone?
Well, I mean, basically, happiness is, I presume now, is already a relative concept. If there is less fighting, if there's no bombings, that's probably be better than what is going on now. But basically, it's the bottom line is that we're moving towards settlement just by the facts on the ground that the various powers, including the United States, the Kurds and the Russians, Turkey and Iran, they're basically moving towards sustainable zones of influence. Once those are sustained, you can open up some form of longer-term negotiation. But I don't know if the people actually will have a much say in those zones. It's basically will be where the tanks, the artillery stop. And when they start to negotiate, that will be the bottom line of it. Hopefully this will be sooner rather than later.
Well, that's the final question I'd like to ask you then, Alexander. As you say, the zones of influence may well be set up soon. Do you have any sense of any sort of time frame we could be looking at here where there may well be a ceasefire across the entire nation?
Well, I mean, obviously they have to get rid of ISIS. How long this will take? I mean, I would imagine it's sort of in final stages. Maybe within another kind of half a year, that will be dealt with, and then I think in parallel to that, you will see kind of movements towards more permanent ceasefire and kind of formal acknowledgement of different divisions of Syria in different zones. But you know, that's all kind of predicting. It's difficult to predict. You know, we are just looking at the current trends. Current trends is towards more kind of settled lines of influence in Syria. But as I said, ISIS has to go first, and there's been some successes by the Syrian army and the Russians against them in the east, and Kurds are still besieging Raqqa. So, you know, this will might drag on for another, you know, half a year. But once that's finished, then the next stage can begin, I suppose.